What does it mean to be creative? Am I already creative when thinking about what to cook for dinner tonight, or only when I start creating art and writing books? Well, let's find out. I talked to Peter M. KRASK, expert on creativity, whose work has been published, produced, and exhibited throughout the United States. Working across several fields with many high-profile media clients, Peter has developed a keen understanding of the creative process and the particular challenges faced by creative people, entrepreneurs, and leaders of all kinds. I hope very much you will enjoy my conversation with Peter M. KRASK. What does it actually mean, to be creative? I mean, when I think about, creative people, writers, photographers, musicians, composers come to mind. But am I actually being creative when I, for example, think about tonight's dinner and thinking about, what ingredients I'm planning to mix up in my pot? Is it creativity already?
Absolutely. I think, for me, creativity comes down to something very simple, which is that, we have something in our head, we imagine, and we want to get it out in the world in some form. So that can exist on a whole range or spectrum of activities. So, I think the dinner example is a great one because, you have to imagine, you think about what you have on hand, or, you're in the market and seeing what's available, and you're imagining a solution to that. And what's for dinner is a lifelong problem, right? I think that's always, a chore for people. Now, is that the same thing as painting the Sistine Chapel? No, but it's still a thing in your head that you need to get out in the world in some form. And there's not a person alive who doesn't have to engage with that question or process, in their day. Even, getting dressed in the morning, right? You open your closet and you think, all right, what is this going to look like? Or, what's going to be comfortable? It's, you're imagining something and then you're putting it in a form in the world. And I think for me, that's really what creativity is. And I would also add, and I think, I was thinking a lot about this, because there's two things I always come back to, which is that word creativity is a very loaded word and has all kinds of associations and feelings attached to it. And it means very different things to everybody. And I think, there's that person who, had that teacher who was like, oh, you can't draw. And then, for the rest of their life, they're, I'm not creative. But I still don't think that's true. It's just we've put that meaning on the word, right? I can't draw, therefore I'm not creative. But if you look at, my examples would be babies or animals. Babies and animals innately play. Everyone's born knowing how to play, and it's just something that we do. And, animals play. And we play for no reason beyond the enjoyment of playing, right? There's never a purpose attached to it. Mm-hmm. And yet, it's something we do that gives us pleasure and seems to be, hardwired into us as beings. And to me, creativity is just, do you have a capacity to play? I think everyone does.
Yeah, but apparently or obviously, this creativity muscle, we have it or don't have it in, and this is probably something we are born with in different areas. Like, for example, for me, cooking dinner is a very stressful idea. My creativity is not, revealing itself in this direction, in this field. Whereas where I grab my camera, let's say, and go out photographing, I'm all excited and all really looking forward to what I come up. How come? Do you think it's something that develops, depending on which path our life takes and so on? Why am I stressed? I am basically stressed when my wife asks me, "Can you prepare dinner tonight?" Okay. And Why is it? Why those different fields and those different levels of creativity in those areas?
Okay, well, first, I have 2 words for you when it's your turn to cook and it makes you stressful. Takeout. I had to take you out.
That's the solution. Usually, on my end.
That's not a bad answer, a bad option. Well, I think, it is a muscle, and I think there are things that, we naturally gravitate towards, activities that, we feel comfortable doing and activities that are harder for us to connect with. That said, whatever activity you're drawn to still is engaged with that basic question of, there's a thing in my head that I want to get out in the world. So I don't get as quite hung up on the form, because, an entrepreneur is creative. You're imagining something, a business that doesn't exist, and you're trying to find a way to get that out in the world. A doctor is creative, right? You're looking at a collection of symptoms and you're trying to figure out what that group of symptoms means and imagine that in your head and then get it out in the world with a cure or medicine or surgery. So, I think it's important for people to kind of take a deep breath and look at sort of, what am I naturally drawn to? And, so you may process the world visually, as a photographer, and that may be your way of inhabiting the world. And yet, I look at the things that you founded, and clearly you're very imaginative in trying to find ways of building community or pulling people of like minds together, and you're very organized, and you were always trying to find new ways to refine the community that you're building. Or, to look at Frames, for instance, the magazine, you have a vision of what that publication is, right? And part of what makes it a good publication is that vision, the kind of paper you've selected, the artist that you're featuring, the format. And so that's all, something you've imagined that you've put into the world. Is it the same thing as, going out and taking a photograph? Not really, but they exist on this spectrum and continuum. And I wish people gave themselves more, ease with that idea rather than it's just, this has to be this one thing.
Yeah. I was also thinking, about let's say, genetical part of it, this creativity in us. When you look at children, I mean, when I look at my own children, coming from the same parents, right? Mm-hmm. I'm seeing very clearly, maybe not hugely, but clearly different levels of creativity into different directions, and they are now 5 and 9 years old.
Okay.
So one is drawing more, the other one has less interest in drawing, but maybe she's into building something or maybe playing outside. Do you know anything about any kind of studies that, about this, which touch on this correlation between genes, parents, genetics, and then the creativity in new human beings?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question because it seems to be more a case of not so much a genetic component, but more a question of environment and what's encouraged, and sort of allowing children to express that creativity in the format that they do and kind of leaving them alone with that and making space for that. Because there's plenty of stories of families where, the family would say, well, we're not creative. And then there's, the child who is an artist. Where did that come from? Are they an anomaly? I'm the youngest of 5. And, my parents were big believers in education. So all of my older siblings, everybody has advanced degrees. We were all good at school. And we grew up, my father was a scientist, but he was also a musician and played music in the home. My mother was a homemaker and worked as a secretary, but she harbored ambitions as a writer, and her brothers were writers. So, I'm the only one who's an artist in the family. I have, a brother who's a judge. I have a sister who's a psychiatrist. I have another sister who's a lawyer, and a brother who's a chemist. So in some ways, I'm an anomaly. And yet there was something in the environment, whether it's just growing up with music in the house or, seeing examples of people who supported themselves as writers and wrote books, that gave me the idea or the permission that was something available to me. So it's an interesting question. I think the one that's really I'm most personally interested in, and that there seems to be a lot of people are paying attention to now, is this question of epigenetics, where, what historically are you inhabiting in your genes that are passed down through generations, and how does that show up in the world, and how do you inhabit the world? And I think that's really interesting, and may get to that point, that question of, is it an inherited trait? Is creativity an inherited trait?
Okay, but you have this feeling, the opinion that it's rather the influence of certain circumstances and exactly like you say, influences after the child is born, rather than that those factors are stronger in this final outcome than the actual genetic prerequisites.
Yeah, I think that's my personal sense of it, and that cuts both ways, because it could also be, someone who's raised in an environment, and one hopes this isn't the case, but, where a parent keeps telling a child, like, don't do that, or, you shouldn't do that, or, why are you wasting your time on that activity? And in some ways, that can increase the drive or desire to express yourself, or, be a musician, let's say, or an actor. And, I still think it's probably better, if a child's raised in an environment where that creativity is encouraged, and, a child's allowed to experiment and, just play, basically. And I think then it becomes something that's much more, it's less fraught. You have easier access to it. But I also think it's funny, I was listening to an interview the other night with the artist, Nick Cave, who's an American artist who makes these amazing sound series that are kind of sculptures that he wears that make noise, that he does performance. And I was struck listening to him, sort of his own innate sense of personal freedom. And I think there are people who have that. I'm sure you've encountered them in your life, or that somehow they seem a little freer inside. Mm-hmm. And I'm always curious where that comes from. So.
Yeah, exactly. So it kind of is a good transition to this next question about, the adults. We have different friends, different people we know. And I have an example. A good friend of mine, a musician, classical pianist, working, doing his job, working at the College of Music. But, every time when we meet and talk about creativity, about what we do in life and so on, he kind of wishes, and expresses this wish that, oh, Thomas, I would like to be like you. You have so many ideas you seem to be pursuing, and me myself, I already know that I would actually prefer to have a bit less ideas than I do. But he is apparently struggling with lack of creativity, or maybe lack of ideas, and he is also aware of this fact that those ideas, don't jump up there in his head. Why do you think is this? I mean, and also, like, I always ask him, but is it something that makes you unhappy, or really, like, is it something do you really miss in your life? So what are your thoughts on this one here? I mean, is creativity some kind of a must, or absolutely necessary element when it comes to living a fulfilled, happy life, or not?
Well, I mean, personally, yes. I think it is, the thing that makes us human, and it's the thing that, we do differently. Human beings are the only creatures that tell stories, and that's supposed to be something that's innate to being human. And, storytelling is a creative act. But I'm curious about your friend. I mean, I think, we all have that sense, as we say in America, the grass being greener on the other side of the fence, or other people have it figured out and I haven't figured it out. And, and that's a very common experience. But again, let's look at creativity as something that exists on a spectrum or that has very personal meanings. So you may be the kind of creative person who has all kinds of ideas going all the time. So you would be in the lineage of, someone like Leonardo da Vinci, who was, had his hands in everything and was always trying new ideas and was famous for not finishing work. He was always, the people who commissioned him were always like, Leonardo, when are you going to finish this thing? And there's a lot of stuff that's just not done. And he was on to the next. And then there's an artist like, I say like the Italian painter Giorgio Morandi, who spent his whole life painting basically the same 6 bottles and cups that were in his studio. And, the question is, how many different ways are there of painting these same 6 cups and bottles? That was the only thing he painted. And there's an astounding variation on it and an astounding, ways of seeing the differences in these things. And so, that's one vision that's very tightly focused. And then there's another kind of vision that's very open-ended and making, connections amongst things that, so they both exist. And I think it's more a question of sort of really understanding how that works for you and giving yourself permission to embrace that, because, you don't want to make, we all make work the way we make it. And I think it can be a tremendous drag on the energy of that if you're like, well, why am I not making it like this other person?
You mentioned before exactly him probably thinking in terms of the grass is greener on the other side, but actually, and now we are jumping to the next question from the list. Actually, I'm thinking exactly the same. The grass is greener on his side, because for me, I feel on a regular basis I get this overwhelm of ideas, which I know are not possible to execute within 24 hours a day, including some sleep. Yeah. So I feel kind of blocked in the end, because I am actually, I have phases where I spend more time deciding on which idea to pursue than actually executing one of them. So there is this overwhelm of ideas which are, blocking me. Is it something? Exactly. And then I think about a friend and thinking, oh, you know what? I actually would prefer to be like you. You have one, 2 things in life. You do them very well, and you feel fulfilled and quiet and without all this, ongoing stress of too many choices.
So let me ask you this question. When you're sort of sifting through all those ideas, I'm guessing that's something you do fairly regularly, right? You have a whole host of ideas, and then you spend some time sort of trying to figure out which one is most important, which is most depressing. Does that happen often?
Yeah, well, how it works in my case is usually I get the ideas. Sometimes I write them down, sometimes I don't. I tend to pre-visualize or imagine, or like forecast the final destination of any idea or project, okay. Right? So let's say I'm thinking, it would be cool to write a book. I am pre-visualizing this final book standing in a bookstore, right? This gives me the kick to actually work on this idea further. This is for me. This is for me the main, this is the fuel. This vision this final vision is the fuel for me to actually continuing or pursuing this idea. But at the same time, when I have 7 of them, with those final visions, which seem attractive and make sense, I am blocked. I can't start working on 7 different projects, tomorrow. So that's how it works for me. And that's, I always need some time to finally say, hey, Tomasz, just forget about it. But I need some time. I have the feeling it's taking too long.
So who tells you it's taking too long? Is that a pressure you put on yourself?
Yeah, that's good. Very good question. What I feel some kind of pressure. It's a pressure of getting older. I don't know. It's just time passing, and it's like a vicious circle a little bit, right? In this moment, because I'm like, okay, just start working on it, but I am not sure just yet if it's this one or that one. So the time keeps going, day after day, and I get the second part of this whole equation, which is the frustration that I am not actually doing something, but just brainstorming. So I like brainstorming, but at the same time, it's frustrating me. That's my main problem.
Okay, so here, I guess I would offer you this, just as something to think about. That may just be part of your process. That you do have a lot of ideas, and then you spend some time sort of experimenting with them, and then at some point, something connects, right? Something kicks off, and that's the one that you pursue. Mm-hmm. But I think this is the thing I want to offer you. What if all of those ideas are working together to kind of, bring you to that next point? Because I think, again, to cite the Leonardo example, the ideas on paper look wildly different and not connected. And yet somewhere in the work, whatever work he decided to do, it was all informed by that other thinking. And, and it's very hard to sort of make a linear map of, or an equation of, I thought about this, and then, I pulled it together. But I think you can give yourself a break in the sense that may just be how you ideate and how you form something. And that none of that is kind of wasted energy or headspace. It's just helping you sort of focus and finalize on, what is the thing that feels most urgent and speaks most clearly to you. And yet it's all part of a whole. And I think, sometimes we just have this idea. I mean, I think particularly with people of our generation, we were raised when we were in school, like, know what you want to do when you're 13, and then you're going to stick to that one course and then spend the rest of your life doing that job, and then you retire. And that's never true. People are always changing. The world's always changing. I'm very excited for young people now that they seem to be much more willing to say, like, I'm going to try this thing for 5 years, and if it doesn't work, I'll try something else. And nobody looks askance at that. But I mean, it's not like the creativity police are outside your house and they're going to come in and be like, Thomas, you have to pick the one thing. And if you don't, we're taking a creativity jail.
Yeah. In the end, you're right. I kind of, when I have those, frustrating phases, I always end up with kind of telling myself, hey, just accept it, just embrace it. This is what it is. This is how I function. But at the same time, I would prefer for the future at some point to get rid of this frustration part, Okay, let's be in it, but the frustration is not a comfortable feeling, right? So it's, but maybe for this process, I need a couple more years to arrive at a different point.
Well, and it's important too, I think, friction is part of the process, right? You need a little friction, you need a little something to press against, because that means the idea is, A, it's important and it's meaningful. And, if you knew how to do it instantly, I don't know. I don't think it would be as interesting. And, part of the fun of making things, as uncomfortable as it can be, is having to figure it out as you're doing it and sort of learning to be like, oh, I'm in this part where it's this is stretching me a little bit and I don't quite know how to do this. And, that is hard. It's an uncomfortable place to be, but it means you're growing and really engaged. So maybe you could be a little kinder to yourself about that. It's just like, oh, here's the frustration part of here's what I do. And it means I'm getting closer to something.
Yeah. I had here some kind of a side question written down, but I think you kind of answered it. So, I was about to ask you on any advice on how to choose from those 7 ideas, in this first, initial phase. But I guess the only way to choose is to go through this process, which I tend to go through.
Yeah. But it's not, again, I'll offer you this. It's not as if you're not making things, right? You're a very busy man and you've got a lot of things out in the world. So, it's important to remind yourself of that too. If you look back, because you're anxious in the moment or it feels uncomfortable in the moment, I think that's always a helpful point to just stop for a second and take a look back and see, the mountain of past effort that you're standing on too. And sometimes you just try something and it doesn't work or you don't like it. And then, the good thing for you is you've got 6 ideas that you can try if the first one doesn't excite you.
So let's talk here about this, exactly figuring it out by doing and then possibly failing. So let's talk quickly, about failure. So, okay, going into the process, spending few months or a year on it, or in some cases, 7 years on it, and the idea fails, meaning, there is no positive feedback, there is no success, whatever it would mean to me or to you.
Mm-hmm.
How to so embracing this idea of failure, right? This is a part of this whole creative process. What's the way to accept and also use failure for the ongoing growth as a creative individual?
I have a couple of answers to that because it's a really failure, like the word creativity, is one of those very loaded words and full of all kinds of meanings and pressures that we assign to it. And and I struggle with this myself. I don't want to, make it sound like I've got some zened out perfect way that I make things. But I always ask clients or when I'm working with people on a project, like, what does failure actually mean? We could look at that from a whole variety of standpoints. So like you said, you've spent 7 years working on something and you finish it, but perhaps it doesn't find an audience. Did you fail? I don't know that you did. You finished, right? You made the thing. So that's complete. It exists. And so that's not a failure to me. We all want our work to be appreciated. We all want, people to like it or find it meaningful. But that doesn't necessarily mean if it doesn't happen in the moment that it's a failure. Like, for instance, I've written 2 opera librettos, and one of the operas has been produced professionally several times, but it goes through periods where nothing happens for 8 years, and then somebody hears about it and decides that they want to produce it, and then a production happens, and then nothing happens for 8 years. When I first wrote that opera with the composer Dan Kreischer, we wrote it when we were in graduate school. We were very young. It was produced by the school, but we didn't get a professional performance of it until 20 years later. Was that a failure? I don't know. I don't see it that way. Even though at the time we were both like, why will nobody, produce this? So I think it's important to really kind of examine what that means, and also to sort of, it's the hard part of making things is that, and it's challenging to sort of enter into that idea, but, all we can do is make the work and then do our best to get it in the world, but we have no control over what happens in the world with it. And we have no control over how people respond to it. And, it's important information, to keep coming back to that, although I think in practice it is a challenge to do. But if we look just as an example, I like, the original creation story. So if we go to Genesis and look at that story, it is a story about making things and putting things in the world, as it were. But for me, part of the beauty of that story is that even God doesn't have control over his creation. The things that he makes decide to do something different than what God intended in that story. Mm-hmm. And then that sets another story in motion. And I think that's a profound lesson that we don't often look at, in that story, that all we can do is do our best to make the thing. And then, and if it doesn't work, maybe we can spend some time later looking at why that's the case, and that could be things as, timing or, our skills still haven't been as developed, or, there's a whole host of reasons.
Yeah, I was about to ask you actually about, when I keep pursuing, some kind of creative projects or, ideas or products or businesses, whatever someone might be doing. And then, should we be looking at this ratio in a way of failures, whatever they mean to us, and successes? And, and now, okay, if someone continues with a couple of projects and none of them, comes to fruition or comes to, positive feedback, what would be the one thing this person should be then, slowly starting to analyze, to look at, to think about, to find out what is the element, what is the thing that's maybe missing from the process, from the approach that he or she is taking?
Okay, well, let's untangle that a little bit, because I think there's two results we're looking at here, right? There's the result of finishing, and then there's the result of success, whatever success means. So those two things are entirely separate, right? And I think it gets into this question of why you're engaged in this activity in the first place. So, if the answer to that why is I'm making this because I want to be famous, which is a perfectly legitimate answer. The odds of that are stacked pretty high against you. Although, with all the forms of communication we have now, maybe you could be the one who makes that viral TikTok video and, blow up for a minute. But the question is then, is that something sustainable? I mean, pop music is an interesting example of that. I'm old enough to have witnessed, the whole change of the digital revolution and how music is created. And, historically, if you look at, popular music from the 60s or 70s or 80s, people had longevity. Their careers had longevity. They were able to develop a body of work over a period of time. Sometimes albums were a success, sometimes they weren't, but they were able to sort of keep building onto that. If you look at pop music today, careers are very short. And the expectation is you get a hit right away, and if you don't, you're done. And, that ability to sort of experiment and build over time so that there is a body of work and an expression over a period of time is very different. So, again, these questions are very complicated. Do you want just that one-off big hit success? Are you building a body of work? What kind of longevity? Is it a failure to you if you've been engaged in this thing for a long period of time and really grow an understanding of what you're making and how to make it? I mean, you're a musician. You probably spend a lot of time practicing, right?
Doing my best, yeah.
But at some point, you do have to practice, right? If you want to get better, you got to keep your fingers moving. In some ways, that probably seems like wasted time or wasted effort, because I didn't get it right away, so I'm done. And yet, it's that study showing up and that gradual accretion of skill and understanding and understanding how your own body works, and that's one of the interesting things about playing the piano, right? How much of that is about body weight and joints and levers. You can only know that by time and experience and patience. So
this hunger for fame, you have been exactly observing the society, for some time. I can imagine it increased exactly with the rise of social media, internet, right? Is it something very unhealthy for us?
I don't want to waffle on that, but I think it's not, it's an age-old thing, right? Is being famous going to be the thing that makes you happy? Historically, that doesn't seem to be the case. I think maybe it improves your circumstances and, you have access to things in the world that most people don't. And, a lot of the rough edges of life get sanded off. But, there's a lot of trade-offs that go with that. And I think, fame has become a very strange word now, because it used to be that it was, most people who were famous had some sort of skill that got recognized. Now that's not necessarily the case. Is it just that the algorithm hit you right? Or you had the right meme at the right moment that suddenly blew up, and so I think it's those kind of hits of fame are shorter lived and probably leave people more unsatisfied, because it's how that lightning strikes. It's very hard to figure out how that happens a second time. But I don't want to sound like old and cranky about it too, because I love, some of the dancing videos on TikTok are amazing. There's an astounding amount of creativity there. And I'm obsessed at the moment with this guy on YouTube, the Kiffness, who makes music videos of the recordings of animals like cats meowing or dogs barking that sound like they're talking, and then he's able to turn them into these incredible pop tunes. I think
I have to check it out.
I think he's a genius and doing exactly what God put him on the earth to do. And who knows how that got started, or what sort of is like, wait, this cat sounds like he's talking, I can get a song out of that. So to me, that's a wonderful kind of creativity, and, it brings joy to people. And, he's doing a concert tour. He just did one in Europe, and he's doing one in America right now out of, a cat yowling. So go figure that. And I'm sure when he sat down to do the first one, that was never in his mind as a possibility. So,
Okay, Peter, so let's jump to the last one here. So for those of us, being on this, creative endeavors path, trying, being maybe there, maybe achieving some kind of, getting the ideas, working on it. Would you have like one or two, exercises or something like you could kind of do on a daily basis to like with a muscle, like with muscles, going to a gym or working out? But what about creativity muscles? Is there something we could do on a daily basis to strengthen those muscles?
Yeah, a couple things. This is probably not the most original answer, but go for a walk. Honestly, that's probably one of the best things you can do. Be in your body, and go for a walk a little longer than you think you can or should, because then you kind of get out of that sort of like, I'm doing this just because I have to. But it starts to free up your mind, and, that's when ideas can start to come in, and, being in the world, being in nature, is particularly helpful. And that's something we all have access to, right? We can all go for a walk. So you don't have to spend money. You don't have to buy equipment. And I always, the great example of that is Darwin always says, he wrote the entire origin of species just by the walks he took on his property. So I think that's a great example, that's, an inspiration. He walked every day for several hours, and that's how the book came to him. But I think too,
walking.
And another thing is, even if it's just, again, this is not original advice, but even if it's 5 minutes, just kind of moving your hand in the activity, whatever it is, gets it moving. And, and I think creative ideas, the really good ones, the really important ones, take time to emerge. So even if your hand is moving, it gets it moving in your brain, and your brain's always engaged with that question. And I think it's important to give that space to trust in that it is actually happening in your brain and allowing that to happen. And the best way to do that is, again, through some sort of physical connection. And then the other one, I have 5 questions I usually work, through clients with to sort of help them and figure out their process. And a question I always use, and it's very obvious, is, what are you doing? And sort of taking apart that question on a whole variety of scale and, looking at it as a spectrum. So there's like the big picture version of what I'm doing. And then there's the sort of nitty-gritty details of what I'm doing. But, you're a photographer. The simplest answer to that question, what am I doing, is I'm pressing a shutter. And, we get very lost in our heads sometimes, or our anxiety. And a very simple way to get connected again is just to say, I'm just pressing a shutter. That's something you know how to do always. That's something that's always available to you. And that cuts through a lot of, the anxiety and stress of it, and just be like, well, I know how to do that. So even if you don't know the big picture, even if you haven't figured that out, you can come back to that one simple thing. What am I doing? I'm pressing a shutter. And then you can go do it. And again, once you start that hand moving, then the thing can actually happen.
Peter, I think we are at the end of this list. Do you have 10 minutes more or 5 minutes?
I know, but you keep talking, yeah.
So I have something which is kind of now, unexpected, or kind of unexpected. So I maybe you've seen it. I asked people to send in questions. Mm-hmm. So I compiled a list of 12 questions, but we're not going to 12. No, we will not. But what? So this is 1 to 12.
Okay.
You choose 3 numbers, 3 questions, and I will ask you those questions. And let's go for short answers, kind of 1 minute thing.
Okay.
Like basically to the point. So it's 1 to 12.
1 to 12. Okay. And you said 3 numbers?
3 numbers. Okay. Yeah. Let's pick 3.
3, 6, 9.
Okay. So number 3. Okay. Well, it is a longer one. This is from Robert Schultz. Creativity has 2 parts, the making and the critiquing. Critique is required to distinguish one's best and the second rate, to recognize a true way forward in one's art and to revise. In your work on creativity, how do you address this second critical aspect of the work?
That is a great question and a really important distinction. And I think I would say it like this: you can't do both at the same time. And I think that's often where people get derailed, is they try to make and critique at the same time, and that only gets you snarled and confused. And I think, the way to stay sane in that process is to really look at it as 2 very distinct activities of the larger creative act. So make first, and then critique. So, like if you're writing, it's very hard to edit at the same time as you're writing a book, for instance. Like you have to get through the draft first and see what it is. And then you can go back and edit and make changes. But there's 2 very different kinds of decisions and 2 very different ways of being with the work. And only bad things happen if you try to do it simultaneously. So.
Okay. Great. Mm-hmm. Okay. Number 6 from Adriano Hene. At what point does the use of technology cease to be simply a tool applied as a part of the creative process? The tail wagging the dog, as it were. I am sure others will raise the AI question, but my question is a broader exploration of what is and it's not acceptable in producing a work of art.
Well, I mean, I think it's important always is, to sort of simplify it by it's always a tool, right? Technology is always just a tool to making things. And in the media and sort of the larger public conversation, I think there's a lot of confusion that a tool is the same thing as a solution. And they're not. They're very different things. And a tool ultimately is only as good as the hand that's wielding it. And obviously, our tools are very complex now and getting only, more complex. But it's still a tool. And I think, a way to sort of stay grounded in that is to keep coming back to that a tool is not a one-size-fits-all solution. And I think, particularly for creative people, in many ways, we've always been sort of first adopters. If we look at the invention of the camera and suddenly, that was the end of painting and nobody was ever going to paint again because this tool could make perfect images. Well, it wasn't the end of painting, right? There was just a new way of engaging with what painting could do and what painting could be. And whole new bodies of work came out of that. I think, the AI one is very complicated, and I don't look at it as photography, in terms of image making. It's not actual photography. It is a kind of image making. I don't have a problem with it as a way of making images, and, we can always use tools in new ways to make new images. But I think I'm curious how that got lumped under photography when it actually has nothing to do with the actual mechanics and process of making a photograph. So, we're obviously still sorting that out because it's a very messy, problematic thing.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Okay, the third one, number 9, from Dave Lender. Once you have chosen an idea for a piece of work, do you ever decode on a method or medium you are least comfortable or confident with in order to challenge your work?
Oh, I think that happens often. I think, sometimes, particularly if it's a new idea or a new expression, sometimes your old ways of making things don't quite work, or you need another way of connecting with it. And some people like that just as a challenge, right? I think, for people who draw, there's always a drawing exercise where, you draw with your less dominant hand, because suddenly that makes you observe the thing very differently that you're trying to draw. Will the picture be as good as, one with your dominant hand? Probably not. But you may have engaged with that object that you're trying to depict in a very different way, in a more powerful way. Mm-hmm. So then you can go use your dominant hand and connect with it. Which reminds me, it's funny, it's sort of an offshoot of this, but to go back to your earlier question about something you could do every day, or a way of sort of a challenge to kind of get your creativity moving. And this is a fun one, and I hope everybody tries it, is whatever you're making in whatever form, make the assignment, I'm going to make the worst version of this that I can possibly make. I'm going to make it as bad as I can. The worst drawing, the worst painting, the worst photograph. And I think people will find very often you can't do it. And kind of letting go of that perfection suddenly frees up all kinds of energy and, helps you kind of push through this whatever tightness that you get. And I think that's sort of similar to this question here of, can you use a different form to challenge yourself, because you'll probably make a bad version of it. And I encourage people to really explore that, because that gets you back to play, right? I'm going to really try to screw this up. And then you're playing, right? And then suddenly, you connect to something really vital.
I hope very much you enjoyed this conversation with Peter, and that you gathered some ideas, some triggers that could possibly help you with moving your own projects, your own creativity, forward. It's a pretty complicated and complex process. There is much happening in our heads, in our hearts, which makes us those creative individuals. And when being blocked, I think the best possible idea in the very end is to kind of simplify the entire process, and just to take this very next step, which brings us closer to our dream outcome, being it a book, a photograph, a project, an opera, whatever it might be. So let me know in the comments, how are you dealing with those issues? How are you fueling your own creativity, and so on and so forth? I would absolutely love hearing from you. I will also make sure that Peter, is looking at those comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope very much you enjoyed it.